Excellent. All right, wonderful. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us here today for the seminar series. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I am today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd like to extend that respect to the lands that you may be joining us from and the elders from those lands, as well as any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us today for our seminar series. Today we have Hayley Boxall presenting to us today on desistance from male-perpetrated intimate partner violence. Okay, obviously a very kind of big topic at the moment. Our seminar series is a monthly event that we hold, and we bring in kind of experts from a range of disciplines associated with the forensic behavioral sciences, including psychology, law, and criminology. If you'd like to attend future seminars, please send an email to the email you see on the screen, and you can join our mailing list. Lots of free good stuff that comes through our mailing list, newsletters, invitations to these seminars, amongst other sort of things, so conferences and so on. So it's well worth your time. I'll also be sending out a feedback form to you after this seminar, where you can kind of indicate, how you felt about the seminar itself. And also it'll give you an opportunity to join that mailing list if you haven't done so already. Okay. So it's my pleasure to be hosting Dr. Hayley Boxall today. Dr. Hayley Boxall is a research fellow with the Australian National University, who's been undertaking research on domestic and family violence and sexual violence for over 10 years. She's published a lot on these topics with a primary focus on pathways and trajectories into domestic family violence offending and intimate partner femicide, offending and reoffending patterns of domestic violence, family violence perpetrators, and obviously desistance processes, which she'll be presenting on today. Now, prior to joining the ANU, Hayley was the manager of the Australian Institute of Criminology's Violence Against Women and Children Research Program. Hayley has advised various states and territories and Commonwealth government departments on violence against women-related policy and practices, including the current National Action Plan to reduce violence against women and children. So on everyone's behalf, I thank you, Hayley, for coming to us to present today on your research. Okay, now, are we not? Great. Okay, so just a bit of housekeeping before I throw to Hayley. We'll be recording this session, so if you miss out on some information or you have like some friends that you'd like to kind of show this presentation to, it'll be available on YouTube. We will be, if we have time, having a Q&A following this presentation. So you can ask questions either by typing into the Q&A box, which should be in the top ribbon, or simply putting your questions into chat, and I'll put them to Hayley after the presentation is over. Okay, and that's pretty much it. I'll throw to Hayley now. Thank you very much, and I'll turn my camera off, or my mic off.
All right. Thanks, Ben. Thank you so much for the invitation to present this afternoon. I would also like to pay respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm dialing in from, which are the Ngunnawal peoples, and extend my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any other families who have ties to these lands. Okay. Of course, it's not going to share it on the right screen. Right. It's not going to do it properly, which is just frustrating. All right, well, I figured that one out. Right, so I'm going to be talking about desistance and intimate partner violence with a specific focus on the desistance work of victim survivors. But before I get into it, I want to share a case study, I guess, to get a start kind of thinking about this topic. So I met Alison, not her real name, while I was doing my PhD research. And she met her partner, Gavin, like so many of us do, on a night out on the town. And after a few years of on off dating, they decided to commit to one another and get married. So the reason why the relationship was on off was not because of any issues related to abuse. Alison described their relationship as close and loving and normal. It was because he was in the armed forces and she didn't know whether or not she wanted that life for herself and any future children that they had. But they were very attached to each other, they fell in love, and so they started a relationship. So everything was fine. And then she decided that she wanted to have children, and mutually they agreed to have their first child. And as soon as she fell pregnant, everything changed within the relationship. He became very emotionally abusive towards her and very sexually coercive. And so, what that looked like for Alison was that he would walk into rooms and yell at her at the top of his lungs, and try to keep her off balance most times. He would also walk around after her demanding that she have sex with him immediately, because if he wasn't getting it from her, she was obviously giving it to someone else. So she gave birth to their first child and everything calmed down. And Alison, I guess, optimistically thought that that was just a blip in their relationship. And so that was just something that happened. It wouldn't happen again. Then she fell pregnant again and the abuse escalated again. And this time it didn't stop after the birth of their second child. Instead, it persisted, the emotionally abusive behaviors and the sexually coercive behaviors. So Ellen decided at that point that she wanted to leave the relationship, but for a series of very complicated reasons, she didn't feel like she could at that point in time. And it was primarily that they weren't living close to her family. And she was worried that if she left and sought primary custody while she was not in the same jurisdiction as her family, then she would be tied to that state and wouldn't be able to kind of get the familial support that she wanted. So while she was waiting for an opportunity to move closer to her family, she started to make plans and she started to create paper trails. So what she did was she would talk to domestic and family violence services. She talked to the local police. She talked to a mental health counsellor. And this was because, as she said, she was accumulating a paper trail that she could then use for what she anticipated would be a primary custody battle with their children in the post-separation context. And she also kept a diary. She kept a day-to-day diary to kind of document everything that was happening in the relationship, the insults, the sexually coercive behaviors, the emotional abuse. He was starting to yell at their kids as well. She was trying to document it all. And then one day, Gavin found his diaries. So when I talk about this case study, everyone in the room collectively kind of gasps and kind of holds themselves really tense because they're anticipating that I then say, and then he beat her and she went to the hospital, or there was a horrible incident. But actually what happened was the opposite. He actually collapsed in front of her and started to cry and said, I actually understand now what you've been telling me. This is not the person that I want to be. I don't want to be my dad. So Gavin had grown up in an abusive household as well. So Alison told him, you have to change or I'm going to leave and I'm going to take the kids. And what triggered that point was 3 years of non-violence. There was no abuse within the relationship. Alison was very skeptical that it would last, but it persisted. There was no abuse. She said it was the most emotionally close and positive time in their relationship. They went on fabulous family holidays and she felt like she had her husband back. And so then she felt comfortable enough to have a third child, and the abuse started again and didn't go away. And that's when the separation had to happen. So how do we understand and explain Alison's experiences? We can, as Alison did, attribute it to an outlier, that she's a rare case that, wouldn't necessarily occur all the time in the real world, that it's not very typical of abusive relationships. But if we kind of did that, then we would be kind of ignoring a huge body of international literature that actually tells us that desistance, or I guess the cessation of abuse, does actually occur and is actually relatively common. And those findings are consistent, regardless of whether or not we're asking men about the patterns of behavior that they're perpetrating against their partners, or if we're talking to women about the violence that's being perpetrated against them. But I guess the question for us is like, well, okay, so men who use violence, they do stop within relationships and it is actually relatively common. But how does it come about? Why does violence stop in some relationships but not in others? And this is a particularly important question for us to consider in the realization that most men who use violence will not have contact with the systems that we have made, I guess, primarily responsible for dealing with men's behaviour change. So that would be the criminal justice system and men's behaviour change programs. But we also know that when men do have contact with these services, they may not always be effective in all circumstances. So we know that protection orders have a marginal effect on recidivism, but they're not always effective, in particular if people have to have ongoing contact with each other. So if they've got shared children, then they're unlikely to be effective. Arrest isn't likely to be effective. And also men's behaviour change programs, court-referred men's behaviour change programs specifically, are only slightly more effective than doing nothing at all. So how do we reconcile these two disparate bodies of evidence? How do we understand desistance when it occurs in the absence of very clear evidence that what we're doing is actually the thing that is likely to bring about the change? Happily, there is a broader body of research called desistance research, which really does try to actually unpack this. So desistance research is focused on understanding the factors that contribute to cessation. So why does violence stop? Or how does it reduce over time? So we used to think about desistance as an event. So all of a sudden someone stops offending. But actually, we know now it's more like a process, that it's very complicated. It can take a number of years, where we normally see people reducing their offending, moving towards cessation. So when we think about what brings about desistance, there are many different schools of thought, but broadly speaking, we're talking about maturation. So people just get older and they don't want to do crime as often. And we do observe that with intimate partner violence offenders as well, that they're less likely to perpetrate crime and engage in abusive behaviours as they get older. There's also the social stuff. So, employment, families, religion, access to peer networks and all those kinds of things. We know that they matter when we're thinking about why some people stop offending, as well as the cognitive stuff. So what are we thinking about? How do we view ourselves is really important as well. So there are some desistance researchers who say you have to have the mental component. So you have to want to change in order for change to occur. So it's all that stuff about you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So you can throw all the programs, interventions you want at an offender. If they don't have that part of them that wants to change, then it's unlikely to change. But really, when we talk about desistance, we know that it's probably a combination of all of these different factors. It could be that one is more important than the other, but really when you actually talk to people who have stopped offending, different things at different points in time helped them move towards desistance. So desistance theory and research has been around for about 30 years now, but we actually haven't really applied it to intimate partner violence. And this is probably for a couple of reasons. The first being ontological, in the sense of we don't like to apply criminological theories like desistance that has been informed by interviews and the analysis of data collected primarily for white property offenders who may not be involved in abusive behaviours. And that's because even though we know that a lot of intimate partner violence offenders who are in contact with the criminal justice system are involved in other forms of offending as well. So it could be that they're violent towards other people. It could be that they're involved in property offending, drug offending. Intimate partner violence is a slightly different thing. It's a slightly different beast than property offending. And in particular, one of the really important aspects of it is that it is dyadic in nature. It occurs within a domestic context where the offender and the victim of the crime are engaged in an ongoing relationship with one another. And you don't really get that with property crime or other forms of crime, although there are examples where people perpetrate violence against family members and things like that. But when we're thinking about what supports desistance within an intimate partner violence context, we have this really interesting dynamic and really helpful dynamic, I think, of trying to understand what the victim survivor is potentially doing, but also observing in terms of understanding why men may stop using violent behaviours. So that's the genesis for the project, where basically I wanted to understand whether victim survivors of intimate partner violence had a role and or were motivated to participate in the desistance journeys of their abusive partners. So here are my 4 kind of key messages, because I always kind of want to read the ending before I read the entire book. But this is really what I'm kind of driving at in terms of my key findings, is that victim survivors of intimate partner violence are using a range of strategies to support their partners to desist, to support their partners to stop perpetrating abuse against them and their family members. Victim survivors are oftentimes the only people in the lives of their partners who are helping them to stop using abuse. Victim survivors are very motivated to support their partners to desist. And when desistance does occur, victim survivors usually have a key role in that process. So, spoiler alert, that's kind of what I get at. So, to answer this question, this broader question of what do victim survivors do within relationships to try and support desistance, I did semi-structured interviews with 40 women in Canberra who self-identified that they had experienced intimate partner violence perpetrated by a male partner. They had to live in Canberra just because it was about logistics. I wanted to conduct face-to-face interviews. We did community-based recruitment. So I went through social media, print media, did a couple of TV spots, got a huge outreach within a very short period of time, which was really, really quite overwhelming. And the interviews ran between 30 minutes to 2.5 hours. So they were quite extensive interviews. So did a whole bunch of transcription, chucked it all into NVivo, and did a lot of really detailed kind of qualitative analysis. But one of the things that was really important for the survey, for the research that I did, was that I grouped the cohort of participants into 2 categories. So I either defined them as having experienced desistance or persistence. And for the purpose of this study, because it was exploratory, was the definition of desistance I used was that the violence and abuse that had been perpetrated against the participant had decreased significantly or stopped for a period of 6 months or longer. So this had to have occurred while they were still in the relationship together. And this was simply because oftentimes when an abuser ends a relationship, they may start a new relationship and perpetrate abuse within that relationship, but we may not have as much visibility of that occurring. So we wanted just to kind of understand what was happening in that relationship. All right, so let's talk about the strategies that women were using to support the desistance work of their partners. So broadly speaking, the strategies that women were using could be kind of grouped into 3 high-level categories. The first one being appeasing their partner. So appeasing their partner looked different for everyone, but they kind of, again, coalesced around a couple of key themes. So the first one was complying with the rules of the relationship. So in some circumstances, the rules were explicit. Their partner sat them down and told them very clearly what they expected from them in the relationship. So I expect my dinner to be cooked at this time. I expect you to wear these types of clothes. However, more often the rule aspect of the relationship was much more subtle, in that it was often only times when women broke the rules of the relationship as perceived by their partner and were punished in some way that they started to get a sense of, okay, this is what the expectations are within the relationship. And so a number of women I spoke to said that to stop the abuse from happening, to stop the violence, what they would do was comply effectively. I don't break rules, he doesn't get abusive, and everything is fine. The other strategies that women were using were things like managing triggers and situational stresses. So they would notice that their partner would become more likely to become abusive if they were stressed about, say, work, financial issues, childcare responsibilities. Childcare responsibilities was actually a really big one that women tended to kind of manage by basically picking up the lion's share of care responsibilities for their children. As well as financial insecurity and stress. There were a number of women who said that my partner was always worried about money. So I always made sure that I was in a really well-paid job, which meant that I earned a huge amount of money and we could live the life that he wanted to live effectively. There was also prioritizing the emotional needs of their partner over their own. A number of the women said that there was no emotional space for them within the relationship because they were so focused on making sure that he was okay, as well as allaying the abuser's concerns about the relationship ending. So this last one I found quite interesting because oftentimes women would talk about how they felt that the abuse and the violence that they were experiencing was underpinned by insecurity in the relationship, that their partner believed that they were going to end the relationship and this would cause them distress and cause them to act out. And this is very consistent with attachment theory, which is a whole body of research, which I encourage you to have a bit of a look at if you're interested. But some of the women, when they were saying that they were trying to allay the abuser's concerns about the relationship ending, the way in which that they would do that was very creative and very interesting. And this is really highlighted with this case of Harriet. So Harriet was talking about a time when her partner punched her in the face and killed a tooth, knocking it out, and she needed root canal surgery to deal with it. And she said that even though she was dealing with the major dental surgery and the fact that she had a dead tooth in her mouth, instead of kind of holding her partner to account, she was using this experience as a way of trying to appease his concerns that she was going to leave him at some point. As she said, oh, who else is going to have me when I've got a black tooth? You keep telling me I'm having an affair, but yeah, who else is going to have me when I have a black tooth? And she was really quite surprised at herself why she was basically saying this. She was saying to me, why did I say this? I don't understand why. At that point, with my mouth like, a mess, I was still worried about him and trying to make him feel better in the relationship. But it's actually very consistent with what a lot of women I spoke to talked about. So a number of them said that when they were pregnant, that they would basically over exaggerate how uncomfortable they were and kind of say, oh, look how big, fat and heavy I am. Now no one else would have me. So you can never leave me, right? And I guess when we think about appeasing the abuser, we kind of tend to think of it as compliance, as basically subservience and those kinds of things. But these are really demonstrative of the agentic actions that women were taking to try and bring about an end to the abuse in any way that they possibly could. And the way in which they talked about it was very agentic, as I tried to do this so that he would stop thinking I would leave him, and then he would calm down and the abuse would stop. So the other strategies that women would use included challenging them. So while for the most part, they would do lots of appeasing him and trying to manage and regulate their own behaviors, for a number of the women, they also did talk about instances where they tried to challenge their partner's behavior more explicitly and push the responsibility for the behaviors back onto them. So this involved talking about the abuse and or its impact. However, a lot of the time, again, women said that I never actually named it as abuse. I would actually just talk about the impact of the violence on the family, on him, as a way of trying to get him to engage in help seeking without having to kind of apply that label of abuse. Because whenever they would say, you're abusing me, their partner would shut down, deny, minimize. So again, very agentic kind of creative work that women were doing to try and still get the desired outcome without actually kind of naming the behaviors for what it was. They would ask them to get help, but again, not oftentimes for the abuse. They would say you need some help with your mental health. You need some help to manage your distress and your stress and anxiety levels. You need some support to deal with your drug abuse issues and so on and so forth. But again, one of the ones I found really, really interesting was withholding relational goods. So women talked about almost weaponizing in a really kind of positive way their emotional role within the relationship as a way of trying to bring about behavior change. So within Desistance, we talk about relational goods as the things that we get from relationships with our friends, our family members, our intimate partners. So emotional intimacy, security, a feeling of connection, all of those kinds of things. And within the broader Desistance literature, we understand that people who are trying to stop offending may be motivated by the fear that they're going to lose relational goods. So if I don't stop engaging in drug offending, I may lose my family, and then I'll lose all of this nice stuff that I get out of my family. And I saw very similar kind of narratives emerge for the women in this study, who talked about how they would try to use relational goods as a way of motivating their partners to stop abusing them. So this included things like threats to end the relationship, refusing to further commit to the relationship. So things like their partners would say, we should buy a house together, and they would say, no, I'm not going to buy a house with you. Marriage proposals, refusing marriage proposals, refusals to have children, and refusing to have sex or express emotional intimacy. So they would talk about how their partner would make these overt declarations of love, of like, I really love you and I want to get married and I want to have children. And they were like, I like you, but there are issues within the relationship. If we want to get to that level, we need to talk about those issues. And for some of the women, The reasons for withdrawing relational goods was because they didn't like their partner, because they didn't like the fact that he was abusing them and was making them feel crap about themselves. And they were trying to find a way to end the relationship safely. And so they didn't actually have that emotional attachment to their partners anymore. But for other women, they were very agentically using relational goods as a way of trying to motivate behavior change because they wanted the relationship to continue. They just wanted the abuse to stop. And this is really nicely highlighted in this extract from Jess, who said, in my heart of hearts, what I was hoping was going to happen is that if I remained steadfast in my own values, that they would come to the realization of, okay, she's not backing down, she's not backing off, I'm not getting anywhere with her, as in she won't accept a marriage proposal, she won't go into a mortgage so that we can start our lives in that fashion. So I was refusing all those things with just the hope that he would actually kind of go, okay, if I want those relational goods, if I want that committed relationship with her, I'm going to have to change. And unfortunately for Jess, that wasn't effective. Okay, so this leads me on to third-party help seeking. And so when I say that one of my key messages is that victim survivors are oftentimes the only people in the lives of their partners who are helping them to desist, it's really reflective of the experiences that they had when they did engage in third-party help seeking while they were still in these relationships. So many of the women I spoke to would talk to their family members and their friends about the abuse that they were experiencing. A number of them engaged in formal support services. So some of them did call the police on a number of occasions. They engaged with domestic violence services and shelters, as well as child protective services. And they universally kind of said that even their family members were not particularly helpful in supporting them to support their partners to stop abusing them. So several women said that even when they talked to domestic violence services, the feedback that they got was, if you're still in a relationship with your abuser, we can't support you. We don't actually have the resources framework to support you while you're still partnered with them. When you want to leave, come back and we can help you to leave. And certainly that was the experience of many women, was that when they were ready to leave, the domestic violence services and that system were incredibly helpful, incredibly supportive in supporting their recovery journey. But while they were still committed to the relationship or wanted to continue in the relationship for structural reasons, the level of support that they got from domestic violence services, child protective services, and the police was very, very minimal. And in some cases, more harmful because there was a lot of denial, minimization. And that was particularly prevalent amongst his family members and friends. So whenever she would reach out to them and ask for support, they often would tell her, you knew who he was when you married him. You need to kind of lie in the bed that you've made for yourself. So very kind of unsupportive behaviors. A number of women, so about 15 out of the 40, also engage with the relationship counselling. And I find this really, really interesting because obviously there are a lot of conversations about whether or not relationship counselling is appropriate as an intervention for women who experience intimate partner violence. And what this study really told me is that regardless of whether or not we think they should be doing it, they are doing it. And the reasons why they're doing it make sense to them. While they are still in the relationship and they are committed to the relationship, they don't want to engage with the police or domestic violence services because they do not see that as a safe space to talk about the abuse openly. Because as soon as they do that, there are concerns about children being removed, reports being made, their partner being arrested, and that's not really what they want. What they talked about was wanting a safe venue where they could openly discuss the abuse with a neutral third party. And so, as I said, 15 people engaged with the relationship counselling. So the experiences that women had with the relationship counselling was very, very mixed. Most had a pretty negative experience, and they attributed this to poor trauma-informed kind of practice and the counsellors not really actually understanding that domestic violence was a factor in the relationship. And in those scenarios, participants talked about how the session was often run like a mediation where they were supposed to kind of try and see the abuser's point of view and make concessions, which they said actually kind of made me feel less safe and less protective in the home because I was being encouraged to kind of give him more responsibility or to see his perspective. However, for a couple of women, they said it was really, really helpful to help them to kind of communicate with their partner, but also to provide a safe space in which they could really talk about the conflict and the issues in their relationship without the children being present. So this is a quote from Grace, who had a really positive experience with a relationship counsellor. And she said the main reason that she found it positive was because the counsellor was able to reaffirm the information she was giving to her partner about the legality of abuse within the relationship. So she said there was a specific issue in the relationship where he believed he was allowed to sexually assault her because he said, "You're my wife. There is no such thing as rape within marriage." She insisted that no, that wasn't the case, but it was only when they went to a counsellor who then was able to say, as a neutral third party, your wife is right, there is such a thing as rape within marriage, that she was actually able to kind of get him to understand that. And then they had some really useful sessions about talking about consent within the relationship, and to talk about what consent language kind of looked like. This was a very specific example. I don't think it's necessarily going to be reflective of most cases of intimate partner violence, but I just want to raise relationship counselling because, again, it was just a really interesting help-seeking strategy that we don't often talk about when we think about the service system contacts that women have when they're help-seeking while they're partnered. But particularly when they're committed to the relationship counselling emerged as a really positive space for some of them. So, victim survivors are motivated to support their partner to desist. So part of the study, I was really kind of interested in, okay, so what are the motivations, cognitive states of women? Are they conscious of their, I guess, strategies as being focused on desistance? Are they motivated to stay in the relationships? Like, what are the primary motivations for doing this work? So the vast majority of the participants that I spoke to were very front of mind, conscious and aware that the work that they were doing was desistance work. They didn't have the language for it, but they spoke about how they had a really deep-seated commitment to supporting their partner to stop perpetrating abuse against them or to reduce the abuse. And this was primarily because most of the women were really motivated to stay in the relationship. They loved their partner. They didn't want the relationship to end. And so what they wanted was what so many women say they want, is that they just wanted the abuse to stop. And so they were doing whatever they thought they could within their realm of influence to bring about that behavior change. For other women, they talked about less about longer term behavior change processes, and they were talking about attempting to protect themselves from the worst types of abuse on a day-to-day basis. So for these women, which was a much smaller cohort, they were not committed to staying in the relationship, but they felt that they had to stay in the relationship for structural reasons or because of safety reasons. So they felt that they had to kind of manage the worst of it on a day-to-day basis until such a time as they felt that leaving was a possibility, either because the structural barriers had resolved or because they felt safer. The common scenario that women talked about was, I didn't feel like I could leave because we have kids together, and I didn't want to expose the kids to their non-protective, abusive parent without me being in the home with them. And they felt that even if they witness the abuse that is being perpetrated against me, I'm still a protective parent, and I'm still more protective than if I wasn't in the house with them. And so they spoke about wanting to wait until their kids were either 18 or at least in their early teens, because then they felt that their kids would be able to advocate for themselves in family law proceedings and things like that. And then we have survivor mode, where women said that they weren't really trying to do anything, I guess, front of mind, proactively bring about behavior change or anything like that. They just referred to themselves as being in survivor mode. But what I really find interesting with these women is that even when they still refer to themselves as being in survivor mode, the work that they were doing to try and protect themselves and their family members on a day-to-day basis was incredibly creative and reactive and, as I say, very agentic. So even when we're thinking about this, we should be really kind of interrogating the work that women are doing, because it isn't just survivor mode. There are many women who are very motivated to do desistance work, and they're doing it without necessarily having the language to do it. One of the primary motivators that women had in relation to why they wanted to do desistance work with their perpetrating partner was because they believed that they were redeemable. And this is not really something that we talk about when we think about why women stay and why women leave relationships. We primarily really think about it from the point of view of structural barriers. And for many women, of course, structural barriers are a really important consideration for why they may feel entrapped within relationships. But in other circumstances, it is that they do genuinely believe that their partner is capable of behavior change and they want the behavior change to occur because they want the relationship to continue. So women used a range of different evidence to try and support their belief that their partner is redeemable and so capable of desistance. So things like periods of non-violence after an incident of abuse, so that real kind of cyclical Lenore Walker kind of cycle of abuse. They would say, well, it hasn't happened for a few months, so he is capable of behavior change. Or it could be that the violence hasn't started from the time they first got together. It could have been that they had a relatively non-abusive period at the start of the relationship for a few years, and they were referring to that as evidence that their partner is capable of behavior change. They would also talk about how they have this internalized perception of their partner as someone who would never really consciously want to abuse a woman. And they would use evidence like, well, my partner was a really strong advocate for women. He was always really horrified whenever he found out that his female friends had experienced some form of assault. And so they had this kind of cognitive dissonance of going, but my partner says he hates violence against women. He's a protector of women. So what he's doing to me here in our relationship, it can't be really who he is. And they spoke about that a lot. They had a really interesting way of separating the abuser from their partner. And they'll talk about how the abuser was not him. It was the other person who was wanting to reconcile with them, who was loving, who was attentive. And this is really, again, highlighted by Tasman, who said, I think I'd always thought that's not the real him. The real him is the guy after the blow up who's trying to make amends and, keep me happy and keep me there. I kept telling myself that's the real guy. That's the real him. And this is another quote from Jackie where she was talking about how her internalized perception of her partner as a protector of women was a really strong motivator for her to stay in the relationship and work with him on desistance. And she spoke about how there was an incident where he was actually charged with ABH against his uncle who had perpetrated abuse against an auntie. And how at the time she said, oh, wow, like he was sticking up for his auntie. He was sticking up for women. Isn't that fantastic? This would never happen. And a number of women that I spoke to did talk about this kind of stuff, this romanticized kind of Prince Charming, the rescuer kind of ideology that they had around their partner as someone who was really upset when they found out that they had experienced a sexual assault in a previous relationship, or who had been really upset about a family member who had experienced abuse, or who was a fierce protector of his mother who had also experienced abuse. And this really fed into their ideas of redemption with their partner. So desistance work was not just motivated by structural barriers that kept them within relationships, but again, that emotional attachment and belief in redeemability. So redemption scripts is something, again, that we talk about in desistance research as being really important in terms of if an offender has a narrative that they can tell themselves in terms of this is how I redeemed myself, how I stopped offending, then that can help them to then subsequently not offend. And certainly what you can see on the screen here is the redemption narratives that women were creating for their partners. I won't go into this in too much detail, but I am writing a paper about this. So that'll come out soon. Okay, and then finally, when desistance occurs, victim survivors usually have a key role. So just really quickly, 15 of the women in my sample did say that they had experienced desistance, which they defined as a significant reduction or the complete cessation of all forms of abuse within the relationship. So for some of those women, that period of desistance ran for 6 months, so 4 women, and then it ran through to 10 years. And about the median length was about 2 years. So it was a significant chunk of time that they said that the violence stopped or reduced significantly. But what's really important is that these were women reflecting over extended periods of time, over quite long-term relationships. And even if it was only for a 6-month period, they were able to pinpoint it and say, he wasn't abusive towards me in our 10 years of relationship for this 6-month period, and they could articulate what was happening around that kind of the start and the end of that desistance period. So when we're kind of thinking, oh, well, maybe it's just a case of he kind of just stopped abusing her for 6 months. Maybe this is just a natural blip within the kind of occurrence of the relationship, which is always something we have to be mindful of. They were very clear that these were periods of time where the abuse stopped or reduced significantly, and that was not consistent with the rest of the patterns of abuse that they were speaking to. So this is just a really complicated table that I wanted to kind of use to demonstrate how when we think about desistance, it's not a really easily classifiable thing. I mean, within the desistance literature, we kind of talk about, and then they stopped offending, but we don't really unpack what that means or what that actually kind of looks like. But within an intimate partner violence context, we need to do that because different forms of abuse co-occur at different points in time. It may be that there's only one type of abuse within a relationship, but that's pretty rare. So what I tried to do was to kind of understand the different trajectories and patterns of behavior across the different types of abuse that women were experiencing. And then at the end of it, kind of go, well, did they experience the cessation of abuse or did they experience a reduction in abuse? And what I really found is that the vast majority of women said that they had experienced a reduction in abuse, but not the complete cessation of all forms of abuse. There are a few women who said that they experienced the complete cessation of all forms of abuse. And then there were some women who said that they had experienced false desistance, and I'm going to come back to what that means. So in terms of thinking about what supported men to stop perpetrating abuse against the participants in the study, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of really important ones. So the first one was increasing consequences. And this is related to that idea about withdrawing relational goods, because oftentimes women who said that they had experienced the cessation or reduction of abuse said it was because they threatened to end the relationship or they threatened to take the kids and leave the relationship. But also reporting to the police was for some women really, really important and impactful, particularly when it occurred at the beginning of the relationship. And I'll show you a quote in a minute, but there were a few women who said that I told him throughout the relationship, if he ever abused me, that I would call the police. And then I followed through and I called the police and I charged him every single time. And that seemed to kind of act as a bit of a circuit breaker for the relationship. And this is just a quote from Imogen, who said, I think he didn't think I'd go to the police on him because I had been the person that he'd rung when he was in trouble and go, Imogen, I need saving. And I'd go and save him. So I think it was a bit of a shock when I did call the police. He'd been told right from the beginning, you ever hit me, I'm calling the police. There's no ifs or buts. So she called the police and that stopped the abuse for 7 years. And that was a significant kind of break in the relationship. However, interestingly, the abuse started up again when he lost his job. And when I was trying to interrogate this with her about, well, why did calling the police earlier in the relationship work, but not after he had lost his job? She said, well, it's because he didn't have anything to kind of, to hold him back anymore, because there was no concerns that having a police record would impact his employment. It wouldn't mean that he would lose his security clearance, all that kind of stuff. So he'd lost his job. And so that deterrent kind of lost its kind of potency for him, which I think is just really interesting, again, to kind of think about what works at one point in time may not be effective in another situation, even for the same individual. Okay, so evocation of feared selves. So a feared self is something we talk about in the desistance literature as being basically an offender projects into the future their future self if they continue along that offender path. And that's someone who may not have good relationships with their family. It could be that they've got drug addiction issues. They've just projected into the future, who am I going to be in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, if I continue on this path? And we talk about that. If they evoke that feared self and they are sufficiently terrified of that feared self, then they may become more motivated to change their behaviors and stop offending. So we've talked about that in relation to offenders doing that internal work themselves, like kind of going, look into the future. I don't want to be that person. I'm going to change my ways. But what I found through this study was that in a small number of cases where desistance did occur, one of the mechanisms appeared to be that the participants themselves, so the victim survivors, were evoking a feared self for their partner. And oftentimes that looked like telling them you're behaving like your father, your uncle, a family member who had been abusive towards another family member or something like that. Or kind of saying, look, if you continue to do this, I'm going to leave you and you're going to be all alone by yourself and your kids are not going to want to know you. So again, it's this whole thing of trying to kind of leverage familial relationships as a way of kind of going, if you continue doing this, you're going to be the person that you hate, or you're going to lose access to the people that you love. However, in a couple of circumstances, escalation events also seem to be quite effective at evoking a feared self for perpetrators. So an escalation event would be that incident that participants were really very vividly in their mind as like the worst case of abuse that they experienced within the relationship, or the incident of abuse that immediately preceded a desistance period, so a cessation period. So for some women, it was the first time that he had physically assaulted her, or it could have been that he had perpetrated really significant forms of physical violence against her, so something like choking her or beating her over the head or something like that. And participants would say, like, I just saw his face and he wasn't there. And then when he kind of realized what he had done, that seemed to really trigger something in him, this real emotional reaction. And then desistance occurred for an extended period of time. And this, I think, is very consistent with Alison's experience. So as I said, she was keeping a diary and he found her diary. And when we're trying to kind of interrogate, well, what do you think was happening for him at that time that made him have that massive emotional reaction? We talked about evoking of a feared self, that he kind of saw his father written down onto paper in black and white, and that was incredibly powerful for him and a very strong motivator for him to stop perpetrating abuse. All right, so questions for us. And I'll just really briefly kind of flick through these. So I said that a few of the women in the sample, I believe, experienced false desistance. So how do we define false desistance? So we talk about false desistance as basically being entirely reliant upon the emotional labor of victim survivors, of being entirely dependent upon them. So if they weren't doing all of the work, then the behavior change would not have occurred. And I think in a couple of circumstances, this is certainly what happened. And a really good example of this is Elaine, when she said that basically at one point in time, she decided that she was going to be exactly what he wanted her to be incredibly compliant, follow the rules of the relationship to a T, and she was going to be perfect, and he wasn't going to perpetrate abuse against her. And that stopped, and the abuse stopped within the relationship for 12 months. And she recognized that as having, like, that was the violence stopped. There was no abuse during that time. But the emotional work and the desistance work that she was doing was in itself a form of abuse, where she had basically just lost entirely her sense of self and become exactly what he had wanted. So Elaine's case is what we would call false desistance. However, when we're doing that kind of measurement work of trying to identify, well, okay, has the violence stopped? She did, hand on heart, say, yeah, the abuse stopped for 12 months. It was only when I had interrogated it with her that we kind of went, well, actually, did it stop, or did you actually just, I guess, become so compliant that the impact of those behaviors and those strategies was so similar to abuse, it was basically the same thing. And that's a really important thing for us to think about when we're trying to measure desistance within an intimate partner violence context. Of, it's not just enough to say, is the violence stopped or has the abuse stopped? It's, why do you think it stopped? And really interrogating those mechanisms. Another question for me that arises from this study is, how do we support victim survivors' decisions when we do not agree with them? So we talk about victim empowerment, we talk about victim agency and choice, but for many of the women in this study, they were committed and wanted to remain in relationships that were not safe, and we did not have service systems adequately there to support them to, I guess, support their partner to desist. And so they were managing risk in the community without that external kind of support. So this really raises for us, well, how can we adapt our service system to work with victim survivors and perpetrators who want to be in a relationship together? How do we support women to have the relationships that they want safely? And then finally, how can we build desistance theory into existing interventions? So this is one that I've been thinking about a lot lately in terms of when we try at men's behavior change and those kinds of things, we very much deal with it through a failure model. So it's if you reoffend, you're out, or if you reoffend, the program has failed. But if we think about how we can embed desistance within those kinds of models, we start thinking about, okay, what does recovery look like for men who use violence? What does relapse look like? Because again, regardless of whether or not we want them to be doing this work, women are doing this work already in the community unsupported. And if we continue to have this kind of siloing effect where we don't want to work with women who are in relationships with abusive men, we could actually be making them less safe. So I did really want to get some questions. So I'm just going to end it there. But I wrote a book. It's a really expensive book. So see if you can get it from a library, although I think it's in paperback now. So if you're really interested. But yeah, if you have any questions, obviously happy to answer them. And there's my email address if you want to reach out. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Hayley. That was wonderful. I'm sure if we could hear applause, there'd be applause. Yeah, we can see it. Fantastic. Okay, so as I mentioned before, you can enter your, we don't have any questions at the moment, but you can enter them in the chat or Q&A. I might start us off with a question. I was kind of, it was a really, really interesting talk. I was really wondering how often you thought the strategies that you mentioned in relation to kind of desistance were used in the persistence group. So things like help seeking, things like kind of the increasing consequences and so on. And then I had a follow-on question from that.
Yeah, so I was really trying to identify differences between the groups in terms of, well, why did these strategies work in those circumstances and not in others? Because very consistent in terms of the strategies that both groups were using. The only difference that I could kind of observe to explain why desistance occurred in one group and not the other was really about the types of abuse that they were experiencing. Where women in the desistance group, while they were experiencing extreme, like, very serious forms of violence, very persistent forms of violence, the level of coercive control was not as bad, I guess, as I would say in the persistence group, in the sense of there was a real entrapment element to the women in the persistence group, which just wasn't necessarily as there within the desistance group. And the women in the desistance group also, they had more power within the relationship. So it could have been that they were the primary breadwinner, or they had stronger familial connections than he did. And so they were able to, I guess, leverage more within the relationship, which I think was a difference from the persistence group, because with the persistence group, there was a lot more financial dependence and, again, entrapment within the relationship.
Like one thing that sprang to mind, and maybe this is wrong, but that potentially recall bias might be kind of an issue here, I suppose, with kind of people who've experienced some sort of desistance or, cessation. Might be more likely to recall certain strategies as kind of being effective that like might have been used in other kind of circumstances where there is persistence. So with that in mind, are there plans to expand this work with kind of prospective research?
Yeah, so we've actually just been funded by ANROS to do a bit more of this work. And we're going to be speaking to men this time, which is really, really cool. So that's going to involve engaging with men at point of them either almost finishing or exiting a men's behavior change program, and then following up with them in 12 months' time. And then also talking to their partners about it. So even though it's a men's behavior change program sample, it's a desistance kind of study. So it's very much like, does men's behavior change have a role, but also is it a minor role? Are there other kind of happening for you that are kind of helping you to support desistance and things like that? So yeah, we've got that study underway, but
Wonderful.
You're totally right with the recall bias.
Sounds really exciting. Okay, we have 3 questions, and I'm not going to take others because we don't have too much time. So our first question comes from Chris Tidella. Are you aware of any research or evidence of desistance models and approaches being effective for adolescent perpetrators of family and domestic violence?
The research on family and domestic violence amongst young people is so underdeveloped. I haven't come across it. Having said that, I think that they're probably better placed to do assistance work in the adolescent space than they are in the adult space. And I think that that is just because the way in which we respond to adolescent family violence is very different. So instead of men's behavior change programs, we have this kind of focus on family centric kind of model. So it's talking to the parents as well as the young person with intensive case management and family case management. So I think that assistance work would work really well within that kind of framework. But yeah, I haven't come across any models, unfortunately.
And wonderful. Okay, now our next question comes from Louisa Hackett. Anecdotally, relationship counselors are doing a lot of this work to varying degrees. Have you thought about qualitative research with relationship counselors, asking for their perspectives or approaches on working with couples where domestic violence or coercive control is present?
Oh my gosh, yes. I really want to get into the relationship counseling space to talk to people who have done that kind of work in terms of in a practitioner kind of space, but also victim survivors and perpetrators. Yes, because we don't have that data. I need funding to kind of do it. So yeah, it's a watch this space thing of if I got the opportunity, I totally would. But yeah, just comes back to money and all those kinds of things.
Right, wonderful. And our last question comes from Jess Hill. Uh, Thanks so much, Hayley. Do you or the participants have specific ideas about what sort of transformational changes would be needed to support them to help their partners desist?
So two kind of come to mind. The first one being is that we need to be able to expand the remit of current systems to account for women who are still in abusive relationships. As I said, when they reached out to domestic violence services, they were told, look, we don't really have the resources to engage with you on this, and we also don't know how we would engage with you. So when you're ready to leave, come back. But more generally, when women spoke to counsellors when they were still partnered, counsellors would kind of go, "You need to leave. He's going to he's really dangerous." All this kind of stuff, and that would actually result in service avoidance and disengagement. So they would kind of go, "Look, I'm not going to talk to a counsellor who's going to tell me to leave my partner, who I want advice about." Who I want advice to support. So I think we need to have really uncomfortable conversations. And that's definitely what the feedback was of how do we support women to have the relationships that they want safely? And that seems to be a real service gap. The other point that they made was about the family law system, about how they were like one of the really big structural barriers for them to leave these kind of relationships was their lack of trust in the family law system, and how the family law system was being weaponized against them and was colluding with their partners to make it less able to kind of leave. I mean, it sounds a bit weird to talk about family law and leaving and that kind of thing and the desistance kind of thing, but I think it's all relevant in the sense of these systems are so effective at entrapping women within relationships, and that gives men a sense of power, which then makes them less motivated to do behavior change work. Because when she says, "I'm going to leave you and I'm going to take the kids if you don't stop abusing me," he goes, "They'll never give you the kids. Like, I'll just tell them that you're crazy, and then that'll be the end of the conversation." So I think that there's this really transformational work that needs to be kind of done in terms of working with women who are in relationships that they want to be in, but also ensuring that men aren't being empowered by service systems so that when women are trying to kind of motivate them to change, that they don't have that deterrent sting that they should have.
Okay, wonderful. I think that's it for our questions. Let me once again say thank you very much, Hayley, for presenting as part of our seminar series. It was an absolutely fantastic talk, really, really interesting. And thank you very much to everyone who's attended. If you can please, please, please fill out the feedback form that I send through. Sign up for the mailing list if you're interested, but please fill out that feedback form. That'd be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.